like to welcome everybody to the Dr. Cog Transportation Advisory Committee meeting. I would like to say that our last meeting went very well remotely, and hopefully this one will too. But as a reminder for agenda items and questions and comments, please use the raise hand button to indicate you have a question or would like to speak. Once it's your turn, staff will unmute your microphone and call on you to speak. Please make sure you are also unmuted on your end. If you have any technical questions, you can direct those to staff in the question box. Again, please use the raise hand feature to ask any questions related to the agenda. At this time, I'm going to ask Melinda to list all the attendees. If for some reason you do not hear your name, please email Melinda at mstevens@drcog.org so she can add your name for the record. Melinda?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so it looks like we have Alex Hydright, Alexi Davies, Amanda Brimmer, Andrea LaRue, Andy Taylor, Bill Soroy, Brad Calvert, Brooks Svoboda, Brian Weimer, Carol Buchanan, Carson Priest, Charlie Goodman, Chris Chauvin, Chris Hudson, Chris O'Keefe, Daniel Hutton, Danny Harriman, David Gaspers, Dawn Sluter, excuse me, Deborah Baskett, Derek Webb, Eugene Howard, Flo Raytano, Hank Braxma, Hannah Polo, Jacob Rieger, James Usen, Jan Rowe, Jeff Dankenbring, Jennifer Carpenter, John Cotton, Johnny Rotherman, Jordan Rudell, Julie George, Karen Schneiders, Kenneth Johnstone, Kevin Ash, Kristen Kenyon, Lauren Pulver, Lawrence Talong, Lisa Nguyen, Mac Callison, Maureen McCanna, Megan Davis, Melanie Chiquette, Paul DeSatis, Moira Moon, Phil Greenwald, Richard Pilgrim, Sangu Lee, Sarah Grant, Scott Brink, Stephen Strominger, Steve Cook, Steve Durian, Stephen Miner, Tim Hester, Tom Blickensturfer, Tom Reif, Alvin Vidal Sanchez, Beth Dalbo, Emily Lindsay, Evan Enerson, Kent Mormon, Robert Spots, Ron Papsdorf, and Todd Cottrell. And with that, Mr. Chair, we do have a quorum.
Thank you. By the way, the chair's name is Kent Mormon. Just forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. Also, when you do have a comment, if you would say your name, it would be good. Next, we'll move into the public comment area. We'll open the meeting for public comment. If you have joined by computer, please raise your hand by pressing the raise hand button. We will call on you to begin speaking. If you have joined by phone, please unmute yourself by pressing *6 on your phone. You will have 3 minutes to speak, after which we will ask you to wrap up and your line will be muted. Melinda, please unmute all participants at this time.
All right, thank you. Okay, at this time, everyone should be able to speak. It looks like we do have 2 hands raised. I will go ahead and start with Alexi Davies. She should be able to, she should be able to speak. And Alexi, you'll have 3 minutes. I'll let you know when you're at your 3 minutes to make your closing statement.
Alexi.
Alexi? It looks like they have the ability to speak. Tell you what. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did she unmute on her end?
Yeah, they have a green microphone.
Okay. Yeah, I was muted. I apologize.
No problem.
This is Alexi Davies. I'm from Community Cycles in Boulder, a nonprofit bike shop and advocacy organization. First, we think it is great that Dr. Cog is taking action to achieve Vision Zero. However, for Vision Zero to be a goal, we think there should be a date, and we suggest 2040. The 2040 intermediate goal of 100 fatalities is too many and not aggressive enough. Looks like as late as 2011, we had 163 fatalities. We can do better when it comes to safety. The other point I wanted to stress was with projected transportation budget shortfalls, infrastructure safety improvements, which are the best ways to achieve safe streets, will be harder to fund. We believe that legislative action should be pushed harder, including automated speed cameras that are unmanned with substantial fines and with points against your license, a lower DUI level, and outlawing of all handheld devices will each contribute to safer roads. I want to thank you for your work too. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexi. Next, who do we have, Melinda?
It looks like our next one is from Maureen McCanna, and it looks like she is self-muted at this time, and she should be able to speak. Maureen, you'll have 3 minutes, and then if you've hit your 3-minute timer, I'll let you know so you can make your closing statement.
Thank you. Testing, testing. Is it working?
We can hear you.
Yep,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Thank you. Thanks all. My name is Maureen McCanna. I'm the Education and Safety Director with Bicycle Colorado, and I'm also speaking today on behalf of the Denver Streets Partnership, which recently merged with Bicycle Colorado, the staff of Walk Denver. I wanted to speak to the same agenda item and share some of our thoughts. Bicycle Colorado and the Denver Streets Partnership are grateful to be involved as stakeholders as DRCOG was developing taking action on Regional Vision Zero. We're thrilled to see the outcome of DRCOG's hard work throughout the process and to be so close to the finish line of an adopted plan. BC and DSP submitted comments that we felt would strengthen the first draft of the plan prior to public comment and reinforce this feedback for your consideration before public comment closed. One theme we highlighted was an opportunity for the plan to strengthen its commitment to Vision Zero. Today, we would like to advocate for what appears to be a missing critical piece of any Vision Zero plan, a date by which the region aims to achieve zero deaths. We'd like to propose that DRCOG identify 2040 as this date in its taking action on Regional Vision Zero to replace its Metro Vision Zero goal or Metro Vision goal of fewer than 100 fatalities. Zero by 2040 is an ambitious goal, but ambition and urgency is what it will take to ensure no one loses their life due to traffic violence in our region. Traffic deaths are preventable, and it is possible to reach zero with government agencies, leaders, and the community on board, and prioritizing the right strategies and systems level change. We must prioritize life in our transportation system, and a goal of fewer than 100 deaths does not demonstrate the value of human life and is inconsistent with the true Vision Zero initiative. And if local governments are being introduced to Vision Zero through this plan, it must provide a true understanding of the fundamental principles that define Vision Zero, a goal of zero being the most obvious. We've seen other regions take this step to identify a target date for zero in their area, including Oregon Metro in their 2018 regional safety strategy. This document sets regional transportation safety policy for the regional transportation plan and provides a framework for working towards zero traffic related deaths and severe injury crashes in the region by 2035. Bicycle Colorado, the Denver Streets Partnership, and our supporters are working hard to ensure there is a day when we reach zero traffic fatalities on our roads. We hope DRCOG will identify 2040 as this momentous year. We look forward to supporting the agency and local governments in prioritizing the people in their jurisdictions and making streets safe for all who use them. So with that, thank you so much for your consideration. I want to mention I do have to hop off the call at 2 o'clock, and my colleague Jack looks forward to tuning in when this agenda item is discussed.
Thank you, Maureen. Are there any other public comment, Melinda?
I'm not seeing any hands raised. The unmute all didn't work at first. Oh, it did not work at first, so I just want to make sure that I've opened everyone up. Okay, so now everyone should be open at this time. If you need to make a public comment, please do so at this time. All right, Mr. Chair, I'm not hearing anyone, so I'm going to go ahead and remute everyone. If you'll give me just one moment before anyone speaks. All right, Mr. Chair, we are able to move forward.
Okay, thank you. So we are going to the TAC meeting summary. Is there any discussion or questions about that? I did receive that one person was left off, Melinda, if you could add that person, and that was, just a moment here, I believe it was Alex Hyde Wright was at the March TAC meeting, and it did not show him present. So if you could add him, that's the only change I would have. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and if you want to speak or have a change or discussion on the meeting summary, and staff will unmute your microphone and call on you to speak. And make sure you're unmuted on your end. Melinda, are there any hands raised at this time?
I'll give everyone just a moment to see if we got any hands raised. And at this time, Mr. Chair, I am not seeing any hands raised.
Okay, then we'll, the TAC meeting summary will stand as is with the addition of Alex on there. We will now move into our action items, and as we move forward. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Todd to talk about the discussion of the 2020-2023 Transportation Improvement Program TIP improvements.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Todd Cottrell of Dr. Cog's staff. So this is attachment B, discussion on amendments to the 2020-2023 Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP. For you this afternoon, we have two amendments to your consideration. The first amendment is to the CDOT Region 1 Transportation Alternatives Pool. Just as a quick reminder, for the Transportation Alternatives funds that do flow into the state of Colorado, half are divided and sent to CDOT and further divided among the CDOT regions, and the other half is distributed to the MPOs. This afternoon's amendment reflects Region 1's Transportation Alternatives Funds, where they recently had a call for projects, and the results add $9.8 million in 4 new pool projects throughout the life of this TIP. The second amendment for your consideration is a new project for the city of Aurora. It is I-70 in Piccadilly, where it creates a new $58.7 million project for a new interchange and the associated roadway network changes that would go along with that. This is a reflection of a call for projects from last year for the 2019 Build Grant from the federal government. So those are the two amendments for your consideration. Both of these amendments have been found to conform to the state implementation plan for air quality. And the motion before you would be to recommend to the Regional Transportation Committee, or the RTC, the attached amendments to the 2020-2023 TIP. With that, I'll take any comments or questions.
So if you have any comments or questions, please raise your hand and Melinda will call on you.
Okay, I'll give everyone just a moment to raise their hands if they have any questions. Okay, and at this time, Mr. Chair, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Thank you. We will now entertain a motion and a second for approval of this item. Please use the raise hand icon to indicate you would like to make the motion. You'll be called on and unmuted to verbally state the motion. Melinda, do we have a motion?
Yep, it looks like we have one from Brian Weimer. Brian, you are able to speak and make the motion.
This is Brian Weimer. I would make a motion to approve the amendments as presented.
Thank you. And Melinda, do we have a second?
I do not see a second. Oh, yep, I see a second from Jeff Dakenbring. I will unmute you now and you should be able to make a second.
All right, second that motion.
Thank you. Melinda will once again unmute TAC members and alternates representing their members only for a verbal vote. All those in favor signify by saying Aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying no. And any abstentions? Motion passes unanimously. All right, we'll move on to our next item. And again, I think, Todd, you're the presenter on this, and it's discussion of the fiscal year 2019 Transportation Improvement Program, project delays report amendment. Todd?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, again. So before we begin, I just wanted to point out that this report and the amendments that are outlined in Attachment C for FY19 are no way related to any potential delays for FY20 that may or may not take place due to COVID-19. I think we just wanted to state up front that this item in Attachment C is different than what we're currently dealing with. So conversations that relate to COVID-19 haven't taken place yet on how to handle those delays in relationship to the adopted TIP policy. So again, just wanted to point that out before we have some conversations on the FY19 delays report. So if you recall back in December, you recommended the FY19 TIP project delays report, and then again amended this report a couple months ago. So just as a reminder, this report outlines the FY19 DRCOG funded projects whose phases were not initiated. It also reviews and outlines projects that were delayed in FY18 and that were still delayed as of last October for a second year. The approval from the FY19 Station Area Master Plan Urban Center Set-Aside or STAMP Set-Aside call for projects took place last in February of 2019. So due to this approval not being at the beginning of the federal fiscal year, but instead closer to the midpoint of the federal fiscal year, the FY19 project delay cycle was noted to end on April 1st of this year instead of back on October 1st of 2019. So the amendments that are shown in the track changes and a link near the bottom of your memo to add these three FY19 first year delay projects to the report are necessary. As of the projects approved for the funding during that call, these are the projects that are now considered first year delayed, and there's three of them. So I'm not planning at this time to go through these individually, but certainly happy to take any comments or questions, whether it's something that myself can answer or another staff person. But at this time, if you have any comments or questions, again, we are certainly happy to take those. But the motion before you this afternoon would be to recommend the FY19 project delays report amendments to the Regional Transportation Committee.
Thank you, Todd. Again, a reminder, if you want to make comment, please raise your hand and Melinda will call on you. Melinda, do we have any that would like to speak?
I'll give everyone just a moment to get those hands raised in case anyone has a question or a comment. Okay, and at this time, I am not seeing any hands raised.
Okay. We'll now entertain a motion and a second for approval of this agenda item. Please raise your hand to indicate you would like to make the motion, and you'll be called on and unmuted to state the motion. And Melinda, do we have a motion?
It looks like we did have one from John Cotton. John, would you still like to make the motion?
Yes, I'll make the motion that we approve the FY 2021 Unified Planning Work Program.
John, we're actually on the TIP improvement delays report.
I'm sorry, TIP improvement report. Thank you.
Okay. And Melinda, do we have a second?
It looks like we do have a second from Steve Durian. So Steve, if you want to go ahead and make, if you want a second.
I will second.
Thank you, Steve. We have a motion and a second. Is there any more discussion? Again, raise your hands if you have any. Melinda, do we have any more?
It looks like John still has his hand raised. John, was that from prior or? Okay, looks like he put his hand down. Okay,
Oh,
and then
all right. Then we'll go ahead and vote. All those in favor, please say aye. And I believe, Melinda, you're unmuting them.
yep, everyone should be able, or all members and alternates should be able to vote.
To vote. Okay. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying no. I hear none there. Any abstentions? The motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on to the next agenda item, which is discussion of amending the fiscal year 20, fiscal year 21 Unified Planning Work Program, the UPWP. And Todd, I believe you're up on that one also.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we'll continue on with attachment D. So the FY 2021 UPWP was adopted by our board in July of 2019 and describes the transportation planning activities to be conducted within the Denver region through this 2-year period. So periodically, amendments are necessary to update the work to be performed, or changes in federal law, or any other financial information. So today's amendments are shown in the track changes version as a link near the bottom of your memo and fall into 3 categories. First is financial. There's included updates in tables 1 and 2 within the back of the document in Appendix A. Secondly, there's updates to the UPWP deliverables table contained within Appendix B. And then third, modifications to tasks and activities throughout the document. So most of these modifications are minor in nature, whether it be wordsmithing or minor moving of text to more accurately reflect what's being completed in the correct activity or task number, or providing additional text detail. I just wanted to run through a few of the more substantial text changes that are included within this amendment. So the first being within activity 5.6 for mobility choice blueprint. We're changing some text around and then changing the title to something new called Transportation Technology Planning. And this is to more accurately reflect what's currently going on, since we do have an adopted mobility choice blueprint. Second, we have activity 6.1, which is the Regional Transit Human Service Transportation Planning and Coordination. This adds the completed project management plan for 5310 as a deliverable within 2020. And finally, activity 6.5, which is RTD-based system planning. This adds additional tasks to the reimagined RTD for additional data analysis and modeling. So with that, I'd be happy to take any comments or questions that you may have, but the motion before you would be to recommend to the RTC amendments to the 2021 UPWP.
Are there any questions of Todd? Melinda, are there any raised hands?
I'm not seeing any at the moment, but again, we'll give everyone just a moment in case it's just not showing right away. Okay, yep, at this time, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
All right. In that case, we'll entertain a motion and a second for approval of the item. Please use your raise hand icon to indicate you would like to make the motion, and you will be called on and unmuted to verbally state your motion. Melinda, do we have a motion?
Yes, we do. Looks like it is from Brian Weimer. Brian, you are self-muted. You can go ahead and mute yourself and make the motion.
Thank you. I move to recommend to the RTC amendments to the FY 2020, FY 2021 Unified Planning Work Program. Presented today.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Melinda? Hello?
It does look like Bill Soroy has his hand raised. Bill, I'll
Okay.
go ahead. It looks like you're just self-muted.
Okay, I'll second the proposed motion.
Thank you, Bill. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? If you'll raise your hand. Melinda, do you see any more hands raised?
I'm not sure why we can't hear Melinda, but there are no hands raised at the moment.
Okay, thank you. With that, we will vote all the, and if you'll unmute everybody so they can vote, I'd appreciate it. Those in favor of the motion and the second, please signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed signify by saying no. And are there any abstentions? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. We'll move on to our next action item, which is discussion of the DRCOG Regional Multimodal Freight Plan adoption. And I believe that it could be that, Jacob, were you going to introduce this, or is Matthew still on the line?
Actually, Matthew is still on the line, so he'll introduce it.
Okay, Matthew, go ahead.
Matthew, you should be unmuted.
Mr. Chair, if we don't hear from him in a second, I can introduce it.
Okay. Jacob, why don't you go ahead? It doesn't sound like Matthew's coming
Sure.
on.
Yeah, no, happy to. So Jacob Rieger, DRCOG staff, do want to recognize Matthew's work on the freight plan as well as our consultant, who I'll introduce in just a second. But just a reminder on this item, DRCOG has been working on a multimodal freight plan for some time. TAC last got a briefing a few months ago. Just a reminder on what this is. CDOT actually recently prepared a statewide multimodal freight plan, and through a subcontract arrangement with CDOT, we're actually using that work and their consultant to sort of take the DRCOG region portion of the statewide plan, refresh some data, add some additional data, do a lot more sort of DRCOG area-centric stakeholder and public outreach, and turn that into our DRCOG multimodal freight plan. So we recently, along with the Regional Vision Zero plan that'll be in the next agenda item, both of these plans have been under a 30-day public comment period. Part of the attachments to this item is the comments and comments received and the responses from DRCOG staff. But I did want to call on our consultant, Evan Anderson of Cambridge Systematics, to walk us through the multimodal freight plan, and then we will be asking for a recommendation for approval. So with that, let me turn it over to our consultant, Evan.
Thank you, Jacob. This is Evan Anderson with Cambridge Systematics. And Jacob, can you confirm that you can see the presentation?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And thank you to our TAC members. As Jacob noticed, this is an item to continue to approve the overall multimodal regional freight plan. Some quick background in addition to the highlights that Jacob provided. The last iteration of this plan, which is a key element of the Metro Regional Transportation Plan, was developed in 2016 by DRCOG, and that was a little bit more of a book report and data. As Jacob noticed, this regional plan really draws on some of the information and data and best practices that were developed in CDOT's statewide plan, and really develops another iteration of DRCOG's freight planning efforts. And so this regional plan, while not a full comprehensive plan, really does provide a blueprint and a framework for beginning to coordinate at the local level and the regional level to address really critical and emerging freight issues. This plan does that by providing, again, that kind of baseline information and inventory. It does identify an overall regional vision network and illustrates really potential future freight focus areas, particularly around industrial development and other opportunities for the Denver region to serve as an important and growing logistics market. I will note that we had tremendous participation from our advisory committee, and thank you to all of our TAC members who served that. In addition, we had private industry represented by BNSF Railways and the Colorado Motor Carriers Association, providing continual input into this plan, in addition to input directly received from private businesses and public in the area. The draft version of the plan that's included in your packet does include revisions and updates responding to the public comment that we did receive. And thank you again for all of those who took the time to review and comment. We got some great input and ideas on how we can look at future industrial development areas, how we can continue to focus on curb management, understand the impacts of freight and curb management and how they relate to transit and active safety. And so we've gone ahead and made many of those changes and updates. And this plan will be continued to be refined and produced through DRCOG. Again, the plan does address at a very high level a number of things. It really highlights a lot of the issues and opportunities within the region, really looking at things like the Aerotropolis, future distribution and logistics centers, looking at a lot of the strengths of our core industrial areas and emerging ones. And then really does highlight a number of kind of key issues, particularly the first and last mile, delivery issues that are really increasing in our downtowns and our growing suburban areas, and along with the curb management and balancing of needs that goes along with that. It does look at potential features, the evolution of freight technology, and does really tell the story of freight and the importance to the local economy. It does start to look for how land use decisions and policy impacts and local regulations really can impact a functional, safe, and efficient regional freight network. Again, the full plan is provided in your packet, and just really quickly, we did highlight a number of priorities that we heard from the public and our partners, really a key focus on safety, connectivity, a lot of ideas and input around sustainability and how the freight sector can help achieve state and regional goals in that regard. Technology is certainly an emerging sector, delivery and curb management again, and then coordination, really recognizing that this is a state, regional, and very much local level in considering and planning for freight. The plan does provide some high-level information on jobs and connections to the economy, as well as kind of key commodities moved throughout the region. Much of this data is available at the county level, should any TAC members be interested in seeing commodities and things like that being moved at the county level or within. As we noted, it does identify kind of an overall regional vision network. This is really kind of an aspirational challenge to ensure that these key corridors, again, function safely, efficiently, and reliably for our freight industry. They're built on different tiers and designations, and again, kind of represents that aspirational network that we can begin to identify and develop projects to help achieve those goals. One of the key aspects of this plan, again, is it really recognizes a lot of the great work that's been done across the country in planning for freight. Particularly examples like the City of Seattle's Freight Master Plan, which dives into different future land use designations and curb management policies and how different local areas serve different freight needs. There really are a number of wonderful examples from across the country, and this plan does highlight a few of those to provide some examples and best practices for our local members and governments to pursue. It does provide a number of key strategies and action recommendations that DRCOG will continue to work with local planning partners to achieve, and particularly really looking at the need to develop a much more comprehensive second iteration of this overall blueprint that can really be kind of called a master plan for freight in the DRCOG region. Some key components of that are strategies and actions related to encouraging kind of local area and very much site-specific freight plans, recognizing that local freight needs can be very, very different across the region. a number of strategies related to how we can better coordinate and really consider freight issues when we're thinking of developing projects and examples and prioritizing those projects and measuring the outcomes. And then really looking at some compiling additional data and information so that the region is prepared to act and evaluate on things. And then certainly not last but least, targeting investments and really pursuing specific grant opportunities, including the National Highway Freight Program, build grants, and other opportunities to really fast forward and advance some of the strategic freight projects throughout the region. Here's a highlight on some of the freight focus areas that are identified in the plan. These are areas that were identified through stakeholder outreach, through kind of existing land use and industrial activity, and through an overall kind of needs and issues assessment, where there's really concentrations of trade and logistics and industrial activity. These areas will be great to pursue, again, that idea of kind of local area or corridor plans, as well as areas where we need to better understand travel patterns and freight patterns and what some of the emerging needs are. So again, in closing, this is really a strategic kind of regional look at freight across the DRCOG region. It does provide that, again, iterative step forward on really addressing freight through MetroVision and through the regional transportation plans. It does provide that initial assessment and data, but with the recognition that there's a lot more data and a lot more that we do not fully understand or can fully capture in how freight is moving across the region and how important it is. Again, it emphasizes partnerships and coordination and cooperation, particularly with the private sector, recognizing that many of these assets are privately owned. And again, DRCOG is fully committed to considering goods movement and all of its plans and projects and processes, recognizing that freight is really still an emerging issue. Freight planning is still emerging, but we really understand that those issues and needs are growing quickly and have the potential to significantly impact some of our communities. I think we're all acutely aware of supply chain issues at this point in time. So with that, Jacob and Kent, I believe we can take some time for questions and then move on to the recommendation to approve.
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate it. Mr. Chair, I do think we have Matthew back on the line, if you wouldn't mind giving him a chance to chime in.
Sure, go right ahead, Matthew.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I had technical difficulties earlier, and I apologize. I was on another call for another pressing matter, and but I'm here now. This is Matthew Helfand, Senior Transportation Planner, DRCOG. Evan, thank you for stepping in to make the recommendation, and thank you for doing a great job on this plan. We've already gone to you previously with a very similar presentation, provided the draft document. The document is now updated as appropriate from our public outreach, public comment period. And so we have a document with content that's ready to be adopted. And obviously we'll take some questions first, but staff recommends that that you recommend to RTC and the board to adopt the plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Is there any, at this time, we'll unmute and raise your hand if you'd like to speak. And Emily, I understand you're gonna be checking that for us right now.
Sure. We have some hands raised. We have Eileen Yazzie, and you should be unmuted and ready to talk.
Okay, Eileen.
Yeah, hi. I hope everyone's doing well today. Matthew, I just, and also to Cambridge Systematic who's on the phone, I was wondering if you could spend a little bit more time talking about the chapter 5, the focusing on freight on pages 32 and 30. It goes 32 through 34 of the freight plan. I think this is a really important section. And can you talk about or just reiterate what this plan is about, and then also the recommendations in this chapter? I think more specifically is, could you talk about, so say that you had $250,000 set aside out of a future uplet, what would your recommendation be to do first?
Matthew or someone want to take that question from the presentation team?
Evan, would you like to start? I have to pull up my copy of the plan. I didn't have it directly in front of me. That was
Sure,
coming from another.
this is Evan. And I don't necessarily have the plan memorized, but it's close. So Eileen, thank you for that question. I think it really gets to the core of being able to provide the region and local governments and members a little bit more concrete guidance on really what are some of the freight needs and investments that we need to make collectively and individually to really make a difference and address a lot of the host of issues and challenges that we do know we face. So it's a great question. We can certainly think of a number of ways to spend $250,000 on priority projects. I think the intent of this plan and many of this, the kind of regional strategies, the freight focus areas, the vision networks, the best practices, is really intended to say that we're not fully equipped to answer that question yet, and that through, again, kind of more comprehensive and continual freight planning, through more specific corridors, specific area plans, local area plans. There's one great example from the North Metropolitan Industrial Area Access Study, which does identify concrete investments in multiple magnitudes of $250,000. And so I think with this plan as a framework, with the ability to consider goods movements in all of our plans, and encouraging more of those corridor plans, we will collectively have a better idea of those strategic investments that we need to make. Sorry, that was a long-winded non-answer, but I hope that helps.
Mr. Chair, this is Jacob. I'd like to chime in as well.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Eileen, to help answer your question, I agree with everything Evan said. I think the point I would make is that, this is the first step in the sense of establishing the regional freight plan, establishing that regional framework for decision making. So the priority corridors, the regional strategies, which is what you're referring to on those pages in the focusing on freight section. This is to start providing that regional framework as a way to start making some of these decisions. Yes, it's true. We didn't identify individual projects. We didn't feel like that was quite the right step at this stage. Just as we don't in some of our other plans to get down to that micro level, but we did want to provide the framework so that we could, as a region and stakeholders, start making those decisions together. However, one specific answer to your question that I'll offer is that, and we'll get to this in about 4 agenda items when I talk about the 2050 MetroVision Regional Transportation Plan, is that, along with the freight plan, the Regional Vision Zero plan, the Active Transportation Plan, we're significantly expanding our planning framework here at DRCOG. In 2050, we feel is an appropriate place where some of that starts, kind of showing up in terms of decisions we make, investment priorities, projects, et cetera. So the point there is that we do intend to incorporate things like the regional, the priority freight corridors, and some of the other aspects of some of these other plans into our 2050 Regional Transportation Plan as a means to facilitate both kind of financial investment priority decision making that we'll talk about in a few items, as well as eventually projects.
And I'll add, thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Evan. I happened to be on a webinar that was freight centered last week, and some best practices were highlighted, and the Atlanta Regional Commission funds local governments and other project sponsors to do cluster plans. So we could certainly, consider doing something like that in the future to enable, local stakeholders to more fully develop more localized plans.
Okay, thank you. Eileen, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay, thank you. Emily, who else do we have? Or Melinda, whoever's checking that? raised hand.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Melinda. I do apologize. I had some technical difficulties on my end, but I am back. And we do have another question. It looks like it is from Jennifer Carpenter. I will go ahead and unmute her, and she should have the ability to speak.
Okay. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Hi, Jennifer Carpenter. I just had a comment, actually. I noticed in one of the slides that State Highway 2, well, Highway 2 was identified as a state highway in Commerce City. A couple years ago, the highway was devolved to the city, so it no longer is a state highway.
Okay.
We can note that when we have our final document, and we can make an adjustment. I'm making a note now, and we can just note that for the final document. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Melinda, is there any other hands raised for this?
Yep, it looks like we do have another question from Brian Weimer. Brian, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and speak.
Okay, thank you. My question centers around the freight focus areas, and in particularly US 85, and talks about the South Corridor, but my concern is kind of the 470 to I-25 segment. And I mean, are these focus areas expandable? How do you vision these being utilized in the future when noticing that section of US 85 that I talked about kind of really tie in terms of reliability and the other factors that you looked at. So can you expand upon that a little bit?
So either Matthew or Evan, you want to take that question, please?
Well, I'll take it first. These freight focus areas came directly from input that we received from stakeholders in the public during our engagement process and the development of this plan. Certainly, we're open to having additional focus areas identified. Right now, the content of the plan is already pretty much final because we're asking to adopt. But we can certainly take that into consideration.
Thank you, Matthew.
Mr. Chair, oh, sorry, go ahead, Evan.
Thank you, Jacob. Just really quickly would note that every single alleyway, driveway, local street, state highway, and interstate carries freight and is really critical to how we, deliver goods and how consumers and businesses really depend on those goods. So they're really critical to think about how every single road and area within our system does play. These freight focus areas, as Jacob or as Matthew noted, were identified through kind of stakeholder input. They are not hard and fast. They are intended to really be illustrative of where things like additional local area plans or sector plans or even specific corridor and site development plans might be very useful in looking at that, because we do recognize there are tremendous differences in regional freight patterns and reliability and safety and access issues. And so this was intended to kind of be more of a spotlight on those areas that have significant roles overall in that broad transportation system. And we can certainly note other key connectors such as 470. Jacob?
No, actually, I'm good. You said what I was going to say, Evan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Melinda, are there any other hands raised?
Yes, it looks like Eileen Yazzie has another comment that she would like to make. Eileen, you may speak.
Sure, thanks again. This is Eileen Yazzie from City County of Denver. Clarifying question to Matthew or Jacob, how much money was spent for this plan?
I'll take it. The budget for this plan was approximately $70,000.
Okay. As a follow-up, I have a question, is that would it be appropriate here at the TAC to consider an amendment to the motion for consideration of funding for next steps regional planning efforts that move the regional strategies outlined on pages 32, 33 of the plan from a future DRCOG outlook? Is this an appropriate place to consider that amendment?
Mr. Chair, this is Ron Papsdorf. I'd like to take that.
Go ahead, Ron.
Thank you very much. Eileen, thanks for that comment. I think it's an important consideration. I would suggest that probably the adoption of the regional freight plan is not the place to do that.
Okay.
What this plan does, what Vision Zero does, what last year's active transportation plan does, is they all provide important input and framework for the development of the 2050 RTP that we're currently in the middle of. Once we have sort of identified those more specific investment strategies in the context of the RTP, we will also be then moving forward in our unified planning work program that really specifies what our overall regional planning efforts are. And I think there will be an opportunity to revisit sort of implementation steps and further detailed planning efforts within that context for future work.
Thanks so much. That statement right there helps clarify just a lot. And I think that's a perfect fit, is again, kind of weave this into that 2050 vision RTP, and then from once that planning effort's concluded, then as a region, we move forward strategically with the necessary planning and next steps efforts. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Thank you, Ron. Melinda, are there additional hands raised?
At this time, I am not seeing any other hands raised.
Okay. Thank you. Not seeing any additional comments, we'll now entertain a motion and a second for approval of this agenda item. Please use the raise hand icon to indicate you would like to make the motion, and you'll be called on and unmuted to verbally state the motion. Melinda, do we have a motion?
All right, give everyone a second to get some of those hands up. I'm not seeing any yet. Okay, looks like we finally do have someone to make the motion. Looks like it is Deborah Baskett. Deborah, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and make the motion.
I move to recommend to the RTC the adoption of the DRCOG Regional Multimodal Freight Plan.
Okay. Thank you, Deborah. Is there a second?
It looks like we do have a second from David Kretzinger, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself and make the second, David.
I second Deborah's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any additional discussion? Again, please raise your hand if you would like to speak. Melinda, are there any additional hands raised?
There are not, Mr. Chair.
Okay, then at this time we'll go ahead and vote. Melinda will unmute you and give her a second here to do that. And then all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Okay. All of those opposed signify by saying no. And any abstentions? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you for that. We'll now move on to the next agenda item, which is the Vision Zero, I believe. So, just a second here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, it's discussion of taking action on the regional Vision Zero. And Beth, I believe it's yours.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Beth Balago. I'm with DRCOG staff, and I'll be presenting on the draft of taking action on Regional Vision Zero, which we are anticipating to take to the Board of Directors for adoption on May 20th. So hopefully most people are pretty familiar with what Vision Zero is, but it is the transportation safety philosophy based on the principle that loss of life is not an acceptable price to pay for mobility. It reframes traffic deaths as preventable. It integrates human error. It focuses on preventing fatal and severe injury crashes rather than eliminating all crashes. It aims to establish safe systems. It applies data-driven decision-making, and it establishes road safety as a social equity issue. So why the Denver needs Vision Zero? I feel like it's fairly obvious, but in 2017, 266 people were killed in the Denver region streets and highways. That's a 50% increase region-wide since 2013. And if you look at the percent of all crashes by travel mode versus the percent of fatal crashes by travel mode, you will see that the large percent of fatal crashes involve people walking, people biking, people on motorcycles. So that's just showing that we need to make a point to focus on these vulnerable users as we begin to implement initiatives. This map was included in the plan, and it illustrates KSI crashes from years 2013 to 2017. That's the 5 years of data that we use for analysis included in this plan. 1,149 people died and 8,827 people were seriously injured during that time frame. So that's almost 10,000 people that were affected by these crashes in those 5 years. We did do extensive public outreach for this plan. If you remember, we kicked the project off with the Regional Vision Zero video, a short survey, and an interactive map that allowed the public to select locations with safety issues throughout the region. We received 3,300 survey responses and over 1,000 interactive map comments. This map is included in the plan also. It shows how the interactive map locations overlap with the data-driven regional high injury network. And as you can see from this map, the data-driven areas are pretty consistent with locations the public identified. The 30-day public comment period for this plan started March 19th and closed April 18th. Dr. Cog received over 200 comments from stakeholders and the public. The comments are included in the agenda packet. We just wanted to thank everyone who took the time to review the plan and submit comments. We tried to respond to all of them and included suggested changes pretty much so wherever possible. So I just wanted to thank you again. The comments you made the plan better and more comprehensive for the region. So the bulk of the plan is the Regional Vision Zero Toolkit, and it consists of the data-driven regional high injury network, crash profiles, broken up by area type, behavior profiles, and countermeasures. The Regional High Injury Network was developed by identifying road segments with the highest KSI crash density, KSI meaning killed and serious injury crashes. We used only KSI crashes from 2013 through 2017. Since the regional network ended up being so large, we decided to do an even more detailed analysis and identify critical corridors along the Regional High Injury Network. And to identify those corridors, we broke each county up individually and analyzed them separately to ensure the critical corridors were dispersed regionally. So for each county, the critical corridors identify the top 50% of KSI crash density along the Regional High Injury Network. And again, that was done by county. Once we identified where these crashes were happening, we wanted to kind of dissect those crashes even more and figure out what's actually happening in those crashes, figure out some of the mechanics and behaviors involved, and then start moving towards certain countermeasures that we might want to apply to reduce those crashes. On a regional scale, we know that the region is very diverse from a land use perspective. Crashes in rural areas in the Dr. Cog region are different than what we see in downtown Denver. So one of the first things we did was develop 4 different area types: urban, suburban compact communities, rural and limited access highways, and we identified those using a variety of data sources to try to reflect the different built environments in the region. So the crash profiles and the crash behaviors identify 3 things within each area type. First being the crash profiles, which look into the specific events and types of crashes that are occurring. These inform the infrastructure countermeasures. Second, the behavior profiles, which are the human behaviors that may have led to the crash happening. One interesting thing we discovered is that the crash profiles are different in each area type in terms of what's causing the crash, but the behavior profiles are pretty much so consistent throughout all area types. Then lastly, we wanted to identify countermeasures, which are strategies that are recognized as best practices for addressing and reducing the identified crash types. So this is a portion of the plan that identifies objection and action initiatives that we as a region need to work towards. There's 6 main objectives in the taking action part of the plan: improve collaboration between allied agencies, increase awareness of and adoption of Vision Zero, design and retrofit roads to prioritize people's safety, improve data collection and reporting, increase funding and resources, and increase legislative support. This is an example of Objective 1, improve collaboration between allied agencies. This objective has 2 main action initiatives, and then those initiatives have sub-actions to better identify tasks within the action initiative. It identifies who will be responsible, who will take lead on the action, and it identifies what year that action will begin. So these are pretty much so how all the objectives are set up. There's 25 different action initiatives that we have identified in the plan. There's also performance metrics that are identified for each action initiative that we will be tracking annually to determine what action initiatives we're making progress on. The plan identifies multiple ways local jurisdictions can get involved in upcoming years. First off, participating in the Regional Vision Zero Working Group. This working group is Action Initiative 1.1, and we will begin organizing this group as soon as the plan is adopted. So it may be helpful if you start thinking about who would be the best local contact for this group moving forward. We also are encouraging local jurisdictions to participate in training opportunities, collect and analyze local data, apply for grants, and join the Vision Zero network. So with that, DRCOG's staff is asking you move to recommend to RTC the adoption of taking action on Regional Vision Zero, and I'm also happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Beth. Melinda, do we have any hands raised for questions or comments?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. It looks like our first one will be from Alex Hydewright. Alex, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Beth. I wanted to commend staff for the tremendous amount of effort and analysis that went into this plan. And I especially appreciate all the detailed countermeasures and how they're outlined for the different land use contexts and for the different crash types. I think that'll be very helpful for us going forward. My current understanding is that the existing MetroVision target is for fewer than 100 annual fatalities by 2040. And I was wondering if you could provide us some, I guess, context or recollection of the conversation that led to that current target.
So
Mr. Chair, this
is...
Go ahead, Jacob.
Okay, sorry, Beth, I didn't mean to cut you off. Just since you were here back then.
I was not.
So when MetroVision was adopted back in 2017, and keep in mind there were 4 years of work that led up to adopting it. So really, talking about what happened back in 2015, 2016, on this MetroVision target, as well as many of the others, we had sort of a long and thoughtful conversation with our board and with stakeholders about what is the appropriate target for several of these MetroVision targets in terms of, what's kind of realistic, what's achievable, but also what's aggressive or assertive. Really striking that delicate balance between, kind of pie in the sky, on some of these versus, not making it quote unquote too easy to achieve, right? These are stretch goals for us in a sense. So at the time, the thinking, and again, there's no magic, should it have been 100, 95, whatnot. And this was well before Vision Zero. So I'll turn this part over to Beth, but I think the point is that that's where we were several years ago. Now the world has changed and our planning framework has changed, just like we talked about with the freight plan. We've done a lot of additional work. We have a lot of additional tools. So Beth, do you want to take the answer from here?
Sure. Yeah, and I guess I'm just going to add to that more than anything. We're updating our 2050 MVRTP plan now also, so we'll be revisiting all those targets. So that's when the target for zero will come into play for the 2050 plan.
Okay, I appreciate the context and the history. And Jacob, I think as you alluded to, that things have changed since then. And I guess from Boulder County standpoint, we would like to see the target year for achieving zero annual fatalities moved up to 2040, and feel that is an aggressive but achievable timeline, especially as a few cities in Northern Europe are achieving Vision Zero today, and that giving ourselves 2 decades to achieve this goal is not out of the realm of possibility. And that being said, we want to acknowledge that it will be very difficult and perhaps even impossible, but that does not make it any less of a worthy goal for us to strive for. And I think regardless of the year, we feel very strongly that the Regional Vision Zero plan should clearly establish a target year for achieving Vision Zero and have that clearly articulated within the plan itself.
Yeah, Alex, this is Jacob, and to you and to others who've made that comment today and previously, we hear that and we appreciate that very much, and it is our intent, as Beth has indicated, to kind of revisit that issue. I think what I'd say, just to put a bow on this part of the conversation, is that we didn't feel it was appropriate right now with the adoption of the Regional Vision Zero plan to do a one-off change to one of the Metro Vision targets. We feel like the best way to address that is in a larger conversation around the 2050 and VRTP and around sort of, where are we at with Metro Vision. So as we do that work, and we are intending to do that work, we will definitely keep this front and center.
Okay, I can certainly appreciate that. I guess our position is that if there was a Metro Vision target that would be worthy of doing as a one-off, that Vision Zero would be that one.
Thank you, Alex. And I believe staff has noted that. Melinda, is there any additional hands raised?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there are a few. Our next question will be from Deborah Baskett. Deborah, you have the ability to speak. You just need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. This is Deborah Baskett. So I appreciate the concerns that Alex voiced, which echo what we heard from the two public presenters. So I just want to keep that on the radar screen. I appreciate that our next logical metric is 2050 plan, but let's keep it in mind as we go forward. And you may hear that from DRCOG board members as well when you bring this before them. I actually had a slightly different question, and if it's in the plan and I didn't see it, I apologize. So highlight it for me, please. So I noted that there was some discussion in the comments also about how seatbelts relate to the high injury network deaths and serious injuries. And I understand in the case of that, we don't have the metrics, is my understanding. I was wondering if I had missed anything that had to do with helmets, both for motorcycles and for cyclists. Thank you.
We did not include a stat on that during the plan. We did add a seatbelt stat, and maybe that's another stat that we should consider adding before we move forward with the board.
Thank you.
And again, that would have to go under the national fatality statistics, just because we're so limited on getting that information with the regional crash data. But again, I think that's something we could potentially add, and I can do further research on that before we take it to the board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Melinda, is there additional hands raised?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next question will be from Phil Greenwald. So Phil, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and speak.
Great, thank you. I'm assuming you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. So Phil Greenwald, just wanted to reiterate some of the comments made earlier. And thank you, Beth, so much for your help. We really appreciate you getting all around the region with this. We know you're up in our neck of the woods, even though I think on the community comments map, we weren't quite shown as Longmont on there, but you did come up there, and we want to acknowledge that you really did see the whole region on your tour of DRCOG. So appreciate your work on that.
Thank you.
Is there a chance? Yeah, thanks. And back to Alex's comment, could we acknowledge that in 2050, at least, if that's the way we're going to be looking at it, that's a place where we could put the idea of a target of 0 deaths as requested by the people who spoke earlier, as well as some of the comments we just have now? Or is it really the idea that we want to save this for a later day, I guess, and not address it here?
I think that
So,
we
Mr.
could,
Chair,
at
this-
minimum, go ahead, Jacob.
Oh, no, go ahead, Beth.
I think that we could, at minimum, possibly add a staff recommendation for the 2050 target. But again, that kind of goes back to our process of taking the 2050 targets through the board as we've done in the past. And Jacob, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would just say that, again, first, appreciate the comment, hear the comment. We absolutely intend to respond to the comment. Do understand that modifying or changing any of the MetroVision targets, we need to do that through the MetroVision plan sort of process, right? We can't just do it here. But please understand that we absolutely intend to visit that issue in terms of, setting the 0 target. And we just want to be thoughtful about, is it 2040? Is it 2050? How do we do that? What plans need to change? How do we work through that? So we absolutely intend to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Melinda, next person.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next question will be from Eileen Yazzie. So Eileen, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can speak.
Sure. This is to piggyback further off of Alex's and Phil's comment, and I appreciate the latest note from Dr. Cogstaff that we'll be addressing that through the 2050. So first, again, just to ask for working with everybody in the region. I know Denver staff worked with you as well to integrate their comments, their thoughts, and their experiences with moving forward with our own Vision Zero plan. And for those that don't know, Denver has an adopted Vision Zero effort and goal of 0 traffic-related deaths and serious injuries by 2030. We have that confirmed, we have that in the plan, and that is our goal. And we would love to see the region, partner with us in helping achieve that goal. And we think that this plan is definitely a step in the right direction. I guess maybe to go back on the comment about establishing a date or a goal, while it says right now the motion is move to recommend to the RTC adoption of taking action on the regional Vision Zero. I mean, can we do an amendment or consider, at least through noting the process that a date is to be set forth, that it's through the 2050 RTP to set a goal, a target goal or a date for for this to be achieved? Is that something to consider? I think what I'm getting is that I think some of us in the region feel just how important this is and how important it is we want to put that a target date on achieving 0.
This is Kent Mormon, the chair. We have not had a motion made yet, so when a motion's made, if that's what you would like to do, you can modify what's shown on the screen.
Mr. Chair, this is Jacob. If I could respond to that.
Yes.
It's certainly not staff's role to, suggest what your motion should be. But again, just want to reassure that, we hear that comment and we're not going to adopt a regional Vision Zero plan and not revisit the issue of how and when to modify our target in this area. So I do, again, want to provide that assurance. If you felt it was appropriate in your motion to direct staff formally to, revisit that issue, you're certainly welcome to do that. I think all we're asking for as staff is let us be thoughtful about the timing and the process and the conclusion coming from that. I don't think it would be fair to all the work and all the process to dictate right here that, it's 2040 instead of 2050, or we should change that goal within 2 weeks. I mean, give us, all we're asking for is give us a chance to work through that with the promise and assurance that we absolutely will do so. And if you want to make that sort of effort part of your motion, I think that'd be fine.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
I have a quick follow-up question about that. I mean, so is it noted in the plan sorry, the taking action on regional Vision Zero, of what that process is. Is that noted in there? Beth, would you know that question or answer that question? Because I think while we trust you and we acknowledge your commitment to this, that it's out as well, but I think it's just, you know, is it written down somewhere about this is the process to do this?
It is not noted in the plan as of now, but that could be a good compromise, I think. If we could come up with the exact year that we want to have zero be the target and say that that's a recommendation moving forward, taking the whole process into account.
Any additional comment, Eileen?
No.
Okay, thank you. Melinda, are there additional people that are on that have their hand raised?
I am not seeing any additional hands at this time.
Okay. Then we'll entertain a motion and a second for approval of this agenda item. Please raise the hand icon to indicate you would like to make a motion, and you'll be called on and unmuted to verbally state the motion. Melinda, do we have a motion?
It looks like Eileen would have been the first person to have her hand up. I just want to make, oh, looks like, oh, sorry, Eileen, did you want to make a motion or were you putting your hand down?
I think that my hand was up from the last comment I made.
Okay.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, so it looks like we do have another hand raised. It's from Phil Greenwald. So Phil, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and make the motion.
Thank you. This is Phil Greenwald from Boulder County. I move to recommend the Regional Transportation Committee adoption of taking action on Regional Vision Zero with the caveat that we revisit the issue, or the staff revisit the issue of a specific target date in the 2050 process.
Thank you, Phil. You've heard the motion by Phil. Is there a second? And Melinda, I'll let you say if there's any hands raised for that.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. Eileen, I did see your hand again. Are you raising to second?
Yes, I am. I am raising my hand to second Phil Greenwald's motion.
Okay. Thank you, Eileen. Is there any further discussion? Please raise your hand and Melinda will call on you.
Okay, I'm looking through and I do not see any additional hands raised at this time.
All right. In that case, we'll go ahead and vote, and Melinda will once again unmute the TAC members and alternates, and at this time, I'll ask for all those in favor signify by saying A.
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 Aye.
Sure. And all those opposed by saying no. And any abstentions? It sounds like the motion passes unanimously then. Thank you, Beth, and everybody for the good discussion. At this time, we'll go into our informational briefings, and Jacob will be talking about the proposed 2020 technical amendment to the 2040 Vision Regional Transportation Plan. And Jacob, I will let you have the mic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I assume everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Jacob Rieger, Long Range Transportation Planning Manager with DRCOG's staff. So we have two items relating to the Regional Transportation Plan. So let's start by clarifying that this item is about our existing 2040 MetroVision Regional Transportation Plan. So as we've discussed, even in today's meeting, everyone knows that we're in the middle of our 2050 plan update. For that reason, we were not anticipating making any more changes or doing any more amendments to our existing adopted 2040 plan. However, in coordination, routine coordination with E470 Public Highway Authority. It did come to our attention that one of their projects that they're working on is actually going to be completed and open to traffic sooner than was originally realized. That project is the sort of mainline widening of E470 from Quincy to I-70, going from 4 to 6 lanes. So we do have that project in our adopted 2040 plan, but we have it later in what we call our air quality staging periods. So this technical amendment is simply just to move this project from the later staging period and also include it in the earlier staging period to reflect the timing of when the project will actually be finished. So we just wanted to be transparent in bringing this to you. Again, it's really just a technical amendment. It doesn't change anything about the plan. We just need to make that one change to stay kosher with federal air quality conformity requirements. But in the interest of transparency, not only are we bringing it to you, but we will be following our planning process in terms of having a 30-day public comment period, having a public hearing, and then we anticipate bringing this to you for adoption in June and asking our board to adopt it in July. So that's really all I wanted to say on that, and I'm happy to answer any questions. This is an informational item.
Okay. Melinda, do we have any hands raised?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll give everyone just a moment to get those hands raised if there's any questions or comments. Okay, it looks like at this time I am not seeing any hands raised.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob. With that, we'll move on to item 10, the draft 2050 Regional Transportation Plan.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. And if someone could share my screen.
We've made you presenter. You just have to share your screen on your side.
Okay, hold on, let me do that. Sorry, Emily or Melinda, can you remind me how to do that?
There should be a pop-up, but it does look like you have 2 names logged in. Should I make the other one the presenter?
Yeah, try the other one. Sorry about that. Oh, here we go. Thank you. Okay, can folks see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So so now let's get back to 2050. Now we're talking about our 2050 in progress MetroVision Regional Transportation Plan. As those who were at the March TAC meeting remember, we had a very long conversation about draft results of the scenario analysis process. And specifically, we hit you all with a 65-slide PowerPoint presentation. So we didn't want to do that this month. We wanted to have more of a sort of conversational discussion type of format for this item. What you should see on my screen is the agenda memo for this particular item. I'm just going to use it as a guide to kind of walk through the items that we want to cover, the issues we want to cover in this item. So let me provide that brief overview first, and then we'll dig into some details. So with this item, again, we don't have a formal presentation. We do have a couple graphics that were included in the packet. The first attachment, the first graphic is just sort of a summary, taking those 65 slides and distilling it down to a one-pager front and back of just what were the major results of the scenario analysis process. So wanted you to have that for reference. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one unless folks have questions. Where I do want to spend some time is on the second attachment, which is the graphic that talks about, really gets at more the implications of the scenarios. And that's really what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about, based on all the results that we talked about last month, what is that telling us about the scenarios? What's important here? What's sifting to the top? And really, what does that say about how we move forward in the 2050 planning process, which we've already started talking about in some of these other agenda items? Specifically, when we get to putting the financial plan together, the fiscally constrained financial plan for the 2015 Regional Transportation Plan, how do we start making some of those decisions about investment allocation priorities in the financial plan? Similarly, as we start building the fiscally constrained network, of projects that will form the fiscally constrained 2050 plan, how do we start making some of those decisions around the types of projects that we're interested in and which fiscally constrained projects end up becoming part of the plan. So while we're not going to solve all of that today, we're going to continue the conversation next month. What I wanted to tee up today was looking at these scenario results in terms of their significance for the process moving forward. So before I dive into some details, let me pause both in case Ron wanted to add anything to that, and if there's any initial questions before we get into details.
Nothing more for me, Jacob.
Okay. Any questions so far?
Melinda, are there any hands raised?
I'm looking right now, Mr. Chair. It looks like we do not have any additional hands raised.
Okay.
Okay. All right,
ahead,
then let's
Jacob.
dig into some details. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm gonna jump straight to attachment 2 and start working our way through that. What we wanted to do here was to put on a single page not just the results of the scenario analysis, but really start thinking about some of the implications. So let me work through this and then we'll talk into some details. So what you're seeing on this graphic is each of the scenarios that we tested, and remember, we're comparing all of these scenarios to our 2050 base, which is our adopted kind of 2040 fiscally constrained transportation plan, but run with 2050 land use. So that's our base, and we're comparing each of the scenario results to that base. If you remember from last month, we had a common set of metrics that we compared the scenario results to in terms of performance against the base. Those are listed kind of here. I don't know if people can see my kind of mouse arrow, but where it says change from 2050 base, things like vehicle miles traveled, transit trips, walk and bicycle trips, person hours of delay. All of those were some common metrics that we used last month to kind of start sifting through the results. And then over to the right, we also made some comparisons last month about how each of these scenarios, sort of were performing against the MetroVision targets. So you see those over to the right. Again, those aren't all the MetroVision targets, but we wanted to pull some of the most relevant and use those as a snapshot to think about performance of these scenarios. So what you're really seeing in this graphic is a couple of things. If you refer to the legend kind of at the top here, there's really two types of things that we're showing. First is a trend, and these are the colored dots. As you see, they go from a negative trend, no change in the middle, positive trend in green over to the right. So that's half the story. The other half of the story is what's happening with that trend. Is it increasing a lot or a little? Is there no change? Is it decreasing a lot or a little? Is there no change? Or is it increasing a lot or a little? So to read this graphic, you kind of have to put both of these together to understand that, first, what is the trend? Is it going up or down? And then is that trend positive or negative? In some cases, an upward trend is positive. In some cases, it might be negative. In other cases, a downward trend, sort of seems negative, and it could be, or a downward trend could also be positive. So we're using both the symbols and the color coding to try and make that clear on each of these scenarios. So that's one huge part of this graphic. The other part of this graphic that I want to spend some time on is the scenario costs. We talked about this last month. We said we would bring this to you this month. We explained what they were in the memo. I want to go over those just a little bit. But for each of the scenarios, we have identified kind of an overall cost of the sort of major investments associated with a particular scenario. So let me spend a moment talking about the costs. I'll pause for questions, and then we'll get back into the sort of performance trend stuff. When it comes to the scenario costs, a couple things I want to say. First of all, these are, as it says here, FY 2020 costs. So these are what we'd call base year costs. We did not attempt to try and make these year of expenditure costs because for any of these scenarios, no one knows exactly when those expenditures would take place. And for a lot of the scenarios, theoretically, they would take place over the course of the 30 years of the scenario through 2050. So to be able to compare apples to apples, we brought all of these costs into sort of, existing base year costs. Again, these are costs associated with major investments that are envisioned in these scenarios. A lot of these scenarios have, sort of capital or infrastructure associated with them that we talked about at the March meeting. So think of this a little bit as like, what is the cost of all that stuff? And stuff is a very technical term associated with a particular scenario. With the exception of the transit scenario, which as you see there, $6 billion, and then $1 billion annually in operations. With the exception of the transit scenario, we didn't attempt to quantify sort of, operations and maintenance for each of these scenarios. Again, that's really hard to do, and you start getting to a point where you're just making assumption upon assumption on assumption. What these costs are meant to be in the big picture is an overall, planning level, very high level, in the ballpark of a planning level of detail on these scenarios. These are not meant to be kind of project level, or design level costs. That said, in putting these costs together and doing the work on this, we did want to, as much as possible, refer to existing or known costs associated with these scenarios. So, for example, in the managed lane and operations scenario, you may recall that was a scenario that looked at managed lanes on the region's freeway and interstate system. We borrowed from that scenario primarily the HPTE Express Lanes Master Plan. So in the costing of the scenarios, we also looked to the Express Lanes Master Plan for unit costs that we could bring into this scenario. Similarly, on the transit scenario and some of these other scenarios, we looked at maybe RTD if it was transit, some of our tip costs if it was other scenarios. We're trying to use kind of known quantities to build up these costs. So I've just said a lot of words, so let me pause there, Mr. Chair, and take some questions on that.
Jacob, is there questions on this from the group? Please raise your hand and Melinda will call on you. Melinda, do you have
Thank you, Mr. Oh, sorry, I was going to respond. At this time, there are no hands raised.
Okay. Jacob, if you want to continue.
Thank you, sir. I will keep going. I guess one other thing I'd say on cost as I scroll down through the table here, just to make the point. So we have a total cost associated with each scenario. Recall that we had a couple of land use scenarios as well. We didn't attempt to cost out the land use scenarios. How could someone possibly cost out a land use scenario? But we do want to be cognizant that obviously, nothing in this table is free, right? There's costs associated with everything. When we get down to the couple of scenarios at the bottom, the infill and the travel choices and the centers and the transit. So these were a couple of combined scenarios where we ran a land use scenario with a transportation scenario. The costs that you see here, the $3 billion and the $7 billion, those are the same as you see up top here associated with the transportation scenario. So in other words, we didn't attempt to increase or change the cost of a combined scenario with the land use component. But understand, as I said, nothing in this table is free. But we wanted to provide this cost information at sort of the very highest level, total cost for scenario, for the purposes of just a relative comparison. And remember, in all of this work of scenario analysis, we're really making these relative comparisons. Again, we're not saying, as I said last month, a particular scenario is not good or bad. We're not choosing a scenario. We're not judging a scenario. But we are making comparisons of each scenario against the other scenarios and against the base, because as this table makes clear, each of the scenarios performs very differently when it comes to some of the metrics and some of the MetroVision targets. So let's talk about that for just a moment. I'm just going to randomly pull out a couple of the scenarios to make that point about what this table is conveying in terms of the performance of that scenario and the implications of each of the scenarios. So if you look at the top of the table with the off-peak congestion scenario, again, this was the idea of so what if we really focused on our freeway and interstate system, not so much managed lanes here, more general purpose lanes, but what if we really focused on trying to mitigate at least off-peak congestion? So specifically in this scenario, if you'll recall from last month, we made a major investment on I-25, basically from one end of the DRCOG area to another, basically from E-470 in the north to E-470 in the south. As well as I-270. What would this scenario look like if we really just sort of pumped up the capacity of those two facilities in particular? So you see here that we estimated a cost of doing that of about $4 billion. And then to walk you through what this table is conveying in terms of performance of that scenario, first for kind of the 4 metrics that we used, again, the vehicle miles travel, transit trips, walk and bicycle trips, person hours of delay. The way to read this table is that first look at the symbol, the sort of vertical line, the minus sign, but it's vertical. That's conveying that there really wasn't much change in this scenario, again, compared to the 2050 base. So it's that relative comparison. The yellow indicates in terms of the positivity or negativity of the trend that it's kind of neutral. So this is really kind of a no change here. In terms of the MetroVision targets, the 3 that we have there, This particular scenario did not happen to achieve any of our adopted MetroVision targets. So let's go down, and again, I'm just going to randomly pick another scenario just for purposes of contrast. If you look at, for example, the centers and transit scenario, so this was a combination of the center's land use, which focused on a very small part of our geographic area, but some changes in some of our known centers in terms of urban centers, transit stations, employment centers. And then we ran that in combination with the transit scenario. And remember, the transit scenario was a focus on finishing fast tracks, free fares, using RTD's regional BRT network of those candidate corridors for federal, state, or local funding. So we put that together, ran that scenario. You see the cost of this scenario is $7 billion. And again, I think I can shrink this down so you see it all, but in one sort of screenshot. But again, here's the measures on the sort of top on the left, and then the MetroVision targets on the right. You can see here that significant, even dramatic change in this scenario in a positive direction for each of those metrics. And then on the MetroVision targets, this one happened to achieve these 3 MetroVision targets. So again, let me kind of stop there for questions.
Thank you, Jacob. If you have a question, please raise your hand and Melinda will call on you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It looks like we do have a question. It's from Rick Pilgrim. So Rick, I will unmute you, and then it looks like you're self-muted and you should be able to speak.
Go ahead, Rick.
It looks like he's put his hand. Oh, no,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There I go. I'm on my phone instead of the computer. Jacob, terrific stuff, and you know, I've been quite interested in this from the start. I've got a question that really relates to MetroVision in the larger perspective, and the criteria that you show there are all good, achieve the MetroVision targets, but they're all transportation related. And I'm wondering how will this, I mean, especially as we're speaking or as we're dealing with the land use scenarios, how does this get reflected in some of the other tenets of MetroVision? For example, an efficient and predictable development pattern, a safe and resilient natural and built environment, healthy, inclusive, livable communities. You know, the 12 outcomes that are interrelated with the transportation component. How does this then relate that direction? And is that a later step?
So, Mr. Chair, I will go ahead and respond to that. This is Jacob. Rick, appreciate the question. That's a really good question. I'm going to start an answer, and then maybe Ron or if Brad's on the line if you want to contribute. Just first, kind of in a nutshell, we wanted to start with at least these transportation targets. As you point out, Rick, these are obviously not all of MetroVision, but we wanted to pull some of the most kind of topically appropriate transportation-related MetroVision targets in terms of starting to do this work of just showing, you know, how do these scenario results sort of jive with at least these MetroVision targets. You know, the role of land use is a very fraught conversation, and we want to have that sort of careful conversation. But I think the point here is that specifically on the transportation side, at least, you know, we do feel like, and this is a you know, question that I think we need to start talking about today. But just sort of as the opening bit on that, you know, we do have an adopted MetroVision plan that says what this region wants to be when it grows up, right? And the targets are not all of that, but certainly a significant component of how we measure, how we think about, you know, sort of performance and where we're going as a region. So here's kind of an open question: should the MetroVision targets be one of the sort of central organizing principles for how we think about this work? I'm going to stick my neck out as just Jacob, the staff person, saying, yes, I think it should. Certainly not the only thing, but it is one of the major tools that we have at our disposal here. I think the conversation, and when you get into those targets, how do the scenarios perform against all the MetroVision targets? That's a more complicated question because I think the I think the scenarios and the work that we're doing in 2015, I think there's a little bit of order of magnitude in terms of we definitely want to get the transportation targets correct. And then I think if you think of this as sort of concentric bands working our way out, I would suggest the transportation targets are certainly the most important. The land use and some of the other targets are certainly there and they're important as well, but maybe not quite to the same degree or not quite the same length as some of the obvious transportation targets. Ron or Brad, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I'll chime in on it. And Rick, thanks for the question. It's a really important part of the conversation, and I certainly don't disagree with anything that Jacob just said. I think he's right on. I think you'll also appreciate the fact that when we're, as we try to distill a lot of information that we presented at the last TAC meeting down to some framework that's a little bit more digestible, we lost probably some of that additional information that we did try to convey in that last presentation, where we talked about some of the other measures, tried to tell a little bit more of a kind of the nuances of the story around those different scenarios and their various impacts. And I think Jacob's absolutely right. We want to consider all of the impacts of the choices that we make in developing the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan in the context of supporting the overall outcomes identified in MetroVision to make sure that we're doing everything we can from the RTP standpoint to support those outcomes and objectives of MetroVision. I think for simplicity's sake, it's easier to start with sort of those tangible transportation outcomes, but I agree that we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of the other measures. And in fact, I would suggest that there probably are some of those other measures that maybe some people think aren't directly transportation related that certainly can be strongly influenced. And we're still trying to get our arms around how do transportation investments influence land use, because there is sort of a bi-directional impact. Land use decisions can certainly impact transportation outcomes, as we I think have seen in the scenarios analysis. But I think to a certain extent, we also believe that transportation investment decisions can also influence land use outcomes. So you can get some beneficial outcomes there. And I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that as part of this conversation. The last point I want to make, and sorry for the long-winded commentary here, is that I think as you look through even this summary of the results of the scenario evaluation, there may be some trade-offs in terms of investment decisions and strategies in the RTP about which transportation outcomes, because some scenarios do a good job of maybe achieving one transportation outcome but have negative impacts on other transportation outcomes. And how do we start to have a conversation around which of those are the priorities in terms of evaluating trade-offs of impacts?
Ron and Jacob, this is Rick again. Yeah, I think that's all terrific and in line with I think a very appropriate study and approach overall. I could see that. Well, I mean, we call it infill and we call it centers, and then we combine those. I could see that depending on how those are then compared to these other goal statements, an efficient and predictable development pattern, a vibrant regional economy, healthy, inclusive, livable communities, certainly would be qualitative, but some of those choices in the transportation analysis could be seen to either maximize or perhaps fall short in helping to do those other things. So if at the end of the process, I think especially now that we're starting to look at scenario cost, at the end of the process, the full range of value should be reflected somehow.
I agree, and that's a good comment, Rick. Thank you.
Thank you.
Melinda, are there other hands raised?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this time, it looks like another hand just went up. Brian Weimer, you may go ahead and unmute yourself and make your question or comment.
Okay, my comment might be hypothetical, but like to see kind of what you're thinking at Dr. Cog is. So when you started this whole process, it was prior to what we've been dealing with for the last 2 months, 2.5 months. And so what is, how does what we're going through with the virus and kind of all the issues that are associated with it, how's that affecting your planning process now? And what have you discussed relative to that?
So, Mr. Chair, this is Jacob. I will answer that.
Okay,
Brian,
Jacob,
thank you for your question. Thank you. Thank you for your question, Brian. That's a really good question. In a nutshell, what I'd say is that, while not wanting to minimize anything that we're all going through as part of this pandemic right now, and I think that there are some lessons we can learn, which I'll come back to in a second, in the broadest strokes on this, we're really trying to take that longer view. We're cognizant that we're preparing a 2050 plan. That's literally 30 years away. And during those 30 years, we had already assumed, for example, in the financial assumptions work that we're doing, but just in general, that our economy and our life is going to go through cycles. We're going to have upturns. We're going to have downturns. As it happens, we're having a major downturn right now. But when you sort of take that longer view and look at 2030, we don't think we see any immediate changes, though we want to be cognizant of lessons that we can learn from this that we can apply towards the work to 2050. So I will give you an example of one of those, which relates back to kind of what some of the results in this table are showing. We're all working where most of us are working from home. And so we see the power of telecommuting. We all see what that's done to traffic volumes, air quality, et cetera. So, and that was incorporated in one of the scenarios. It was incorporated in the, as I scroll down here in the travel choices, there it is. In the travel choices scenario, we specifically had an element of telecommuting and TDM strategies in that scenario. So I think that's one lesson where the pandemic is sort of proving, the power of that particular strategy. So I actually want to take that and sort of pivot to the larger question of, there's a couple of ways I want to frame our conversation on this because I don't really have much more to present, but I would like us to think about a couple of things. One is, I think this table in particular makes clear, and again, we're not choosing a scenario, we're not judging a scenario. I don't want people to react to this table and say, oh, I like this scenario or I dislike that scenario. That's not the point. The point is, as Ron alluded to, each of these scenarios performs differently when you look at some of these metrics and some of the MetroVision targets. What does that tell us about priorities and trade-offs going forward? And specifically, when we start thinking about project types, when we start thinking of financial plan investments, what particular things based on this do we think are rising to the top that we should carry forward as sort of priorities and framework as we put the plan together? TDM and telework might be one of those things. We can see in these results, transit in some form, certainly can be a powerful tool. You all can probably see other things in here, positive or negative in terms of things that we should focus on and maybe things that we shouldn't. So that's really where I want to carry this conversation. The last thing I'll say before I open it up to general conversation to get back to the land use point, we're very cognizant of the local government role in land use planning, and I do want to state that explicitly. That said, our general approach as staff here, Dr. Cog, in putting together the 2050 plan is that we want to deliver to the region a transportation plan that is most successful in terms of implementation. And we want to optimize the investments that will end up, being articulated in the transportation investments that will end up being articulated in the 2050 plan. So in other words, when we come up with a plan that has a list of projects and a series of strategies and priorities and the other things that go into a long-range transportation plan, we want to optimize those investments and help the region and help project sponsors understand what would make your project or what would make your investment most successful. And part of that is land use. And we all know this as professionals that, I think Ron said this as well, that you're not just making a transportation investment, that can have some impacts on land use as well. So ultimately, we want to deliver a multimodal transportation plan that optimizes those investments and optimizes the investment strategies that we'll end up articulating for this plan.
Brian, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think there's some lessons to be learned, and as long as we're considering what those are, some of them could be land use decisions as well, and because could be a short term, but maybe we should learn from this and start thinking about the next that could occur and what that might be, and how do we insulate ourselves from that.
Hey, Brian, this is Ron. So it sounds like you have some ideas around it. Do you want to expand a little bit on kind of the thought you have around that?
No, I don't have any particular ideas, but the question then becomes is, I don't know, generally, and is densification a good thing? Maybe long term it might be. In these type of situations, it might not be. I'm sure there's a lot of discussion around that. Are there ways to, from a healthcare perspective, do we need to look at that in terms of the region? I know there was a lot of emphasis on that in MetroVision. Are we accomplishing some of those goals? So just general, gee whiz, are we thinking about this? Because the world has changed, and I don't know if it will go back to norm as the way we know it prior to this.
Ron, any more comment?
No, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Brian, are you satisfied with the discussion?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. Melinda, are there other hands raised?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it looks like we do have another hand raised from David Pressinger. So David, if you just want to go ahead and unmute yourself and you can make your question or comment.
Thanks, Melinda and Dr. Cog staff. Yeah, I'm fascinated by this table and the kind of choices and direction that may give us. In reaction to both Rick and Brian's comments, I think with the amount of growth that we have coming to the entire Front Range region, we're going to see densification of some sort. What that looks like, I think, is the most important question. And I look at other cities around the world and around the country. I look at like Washington, D.C. that has height limits, and you have more of a uniform densification all the way across the whole city. And then there's other places that have not placed height limits or sort of density limits, if you will. And what you'll see there is more of densification along corridors. And then that leaves really nice pockets between the corridors of low density neighborhoods that I think are more typical of what we see in the Denver metro area, particularly in our suburban communities. So I think the interaction of the two is really important. The second point I'll make is that I think the financial constraints over a 30-year time horizon could be quite different, So if we had a lower expense type of strategy, we could spend $3 billion in 30 years. I think it's also imaginable that we could be on the order of 10 or 12 billion over a 30-year period if you take fast tracks as having spent 6 billion in 15 years, and the highway side still going. So I think sort of financial constraints and land use and transportation trade-offs are really important.
Thank you, David. Does Dr. Cog's staff want to respond at all?
I'll just say I appreciate the comment. This is the kind of discussion we're looking for here of, what seems significant, what rises to the top, what does this say about the direction that we think we want to go.
Okay. Melinda, are there additional hands raised?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this time, I am seeing no additional hands that are raised.
Okay. Jacob, did you have some additional comments you wanted to go with, or were you done with your presentation?
Yeah, no, I'm done with my presentation, Mr. Chair. I think the only thing I'll say is that we're tentatively right now anticipating coming back at the May meeting based on the input that we get today and start to have more of a brass tacks, maybe a workshop type of conversation around the financial plan and around thinking about fiscally constrained projects, to how do we start identifying those and evaluating those for inclusion in the plan. So we wanted to hear today in terms of, significance, priorities, trade-offs, direction to help inform that work that we'll bring to you in May.
Okay. Thank you for that. The chair would like to make one comment. First of all, I appreciate the chart that you put together. It really boils down those 55 slides to something that I think our elected officials could actually digest. I know it helped me. The second one is I have to agree with Brian. I think you're going to see changes come out of this. I think employees and employers have gotten used to teleworking, and I think that could really influence our modeling as we move forward. So it'll be interesting to see as we go to this new normal, what that whether we see the number of vehicles back on the road and transit use as well. So with that, I think we're ready to move on to our next item. It's member comments and other matters, and I believe we have a small area forecast comment period in May. Was there someone to take that on your side, Jacob?
Yes, Andy Taylor of our regional planning staff will speak to that.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Cog is about to open up an opportunity for local input on the small area forecast, specifically in the month of May, through an interactive web comment map. We did something similar back in September, but this is a new and improved product. This forecast will be used as part of the 2050 regional transportation planning process. Also, we've been coordinating with other folks that use the forecast product, so your feedback at this step will also help improve the forecast's other uses, such as with RTD's Reimagine effort. We have an email that's actually scheduled to go out tomorrow to local government planners, so some of the folks that some of you here work with. And so it'll go out tomorrow to recommend that staff reserve some time in the month of May to review the map, have some internal discussions, and potentially add any comments or questions during that month of May. For those of you here working for local governments, I really would encourage you to reach out to your planning peers and just help explain the importance of improving this forecast through their local knowledge. There's only so much we can do with modeling, and some things that we just have yet to learn about, or that models just aren't going to pick up, especially in the short term. And so their local knowledge is really important, and that map will be open for comment throughout the month of May. So thank you for just letting us give a quick update.
Thank you, Andy. Carson, do you have an update on the AMP working group?
Sure, thanks, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I'll keep it short. The AMP working group met in April, and we received word from the chair that the executive committee of AMP approved the group's initial prioritization of tactical actions from the Mobility Choice Blueprint plan. As we continue as a group to work on fleshing out these prioritizations, there will be a series of focus area steering committees formed under each tactical action category. If you have questions about those, please feel free to reach out to me or Emily Lindsay. The committees will be tasked with creating action items for starting to work on each tactical actions, including members from Dr. Cog, CDOT, RTD, Denver Metro Chamber, and other groups like University Council and TMAs and others. There was also an announcement about a new FTA funding opportunity titled Accelerating Innovative Mobility Challenge Grants. And there was the discussion among the group about possible joint applications for this grant in the future. We heard briefings about the RTD Easy Mile 61 AV demonstration project, the CDOT Emerging Mobility Impact Study, and the Colorado Smart Cities Alliance Deployment Board. If you have questions, like I said before, please feel free to reach out to me after this meeting, and I'll be happy to answer them, or Emily Lindsay can help as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Carson. At this time, are there any other member comments or other matters that need to come before this committee? If you so indicate by raising your hand, and Melinda will call on you.
Mr. Chair, this is Ron take prerogative
ahead.
first while people are raising their hands if they have anything else. Do appreciate everyone's time today. I know this was a long meeting, and I think the May meeting will be slightly less. I also wanted to circle back a little bit to what Todd mentioned early on in the agenda about project delays, and remind everyone today that we did put out an email request through Todd to jurisdictions seeking any information you might have so far on potential financial impacts that may affect ability to move forward either on schedule or at all locally sponsored TIP projects. We obviously have been giving a lot of thought to sort of understanding local jurisdiction financial impacts of the economic impacts of responding to COVID-19, and want to get our arms around sort of what those impacts are and potential strategies. I expect we'll probably put something on the May agenda to have a little bit more of a conversation as we learn more. I know there's still a lot of uncertainty, but by the May meeting, we will have the May state revenue forecasts. Probably local jurisdictions might by then have a little bit more of a handle on local financial impacts from your local tax revenues. Maybe we'll have a little bit more information about any potential federal action that might bring more resources to bear on infrastructure as part of economic recovery from COVID-19. So with that in mind, I just wanted to reassure everyone that while we don't really have anything concrete to talk to today, that we are giving a lot of thought and consideration to it. And to the extent that you can share information with us, we can have a good, robust conversation at the May meeting about potential strategies and how we might help each other move forward.
Thank you, Ron. Melinda, are there any other hands raised?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It looks like at this time we have no additional hands raised.
Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for participating. Our next meeting is May 18th. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.